Now that we have approval from the keepers of the technical difficulties, welcome to the second talk in this room this morning. I am very pleased to introduce James Smith, whose name is easy to pronounce, with a talk entitled "Don't Use VS Code." As somebody who doesn't use VS Code, I'm very interested to find out why I shouldn't. James, over to you.
Thank you. So, good morning, and those of you that have come to heckle me, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. That is the theme of my talk today, and it's going to be disappointment, because I'm actually going. The title is a bit clickbaity. I'm actually going to tell you why VS Code is actually very, very good. What I'm not going to do is make some sort of moral judgment about who's the real programmer based on what editor they use. I do make those judgments privately, but I'm not going to share them today. That's not the topic of my talk. But first of all, I'm going to run you through a brief and probably somewhat distorted history of how we got to where we are, starting off in 1995, when once upon a time there was a company called Netscape, and they had a browser, and in an irresponsibly short amount of time, they defined a language called JavaScript to make websites do more exciting things. And now we're stuck with it. This is a Python conference, so I feel entitled to trash talk JavaScript a little bit. So by the time 2012 rolled around, it was fairly clear that JavaScript was not going away despite everyone's best efforts. But the problem was there was not really agreement on what exactly was wrong with JavaScript. Microsoft thought that JavaScript's lack of strict typing was wrong, and so they gave us TypeScript, which is syntactically exactly the same as JavaScript, but adds typing. And they said, all right, go forth, use it. But people complained because there wasn't really nice tooling, and as you know, developers like nice tooling. They didn't really want to shell out for a Visual Studio license, which is very expensive. So adoption of TypeScript initially was a little bit slow. In the meantime, the good folks at GitHub gave us Atom. Why did they do that? Well, they said we need an editor, and we need it to be hackable, and we don't know about Lisp. So perhaps they had PTSD from when they tried to learn Emacs previously. It was just, I don't know. But we're web developers, so we know web technology. So let's take Chrome and butcher it a little bit, and then we can use JavaScript to write desktop applications. So we got Electron, and so if you love products like Slack or MS Teams or other such very good things, you have Electron to thank for that. While this was going on, Microsoft was looking over their shoulder and thinking, well, we could probably do that. We can use Electron, and we can use TypeScript, and we can make an editor for our users to use. What should we call it? We've got Visual Studio already. We'll call it Visual Studio Code. And so this was born. We know the rest of the history. In 2018, Microsoft acquired GitHub, and Atom and VS Code filled largely the same sort of ecosystem niche. And so, you know, the whole Hunger Games ethos, only one can survive. Fast forward to today, and VS Code has taken the world by storm. So this looks awful, but this is the StackOverflow developer survey for this year, and the particular question regards IDEs. And of respondents to this survey, an overwhelming majority, like by a country mile, so much that it's not even funny, VS Code is the dominant tool. Number two is Visual Studio itself, but less than half of the market share that VS Code has. So there must be a reason for this. And the reason is that Visual Studio Code is actually very, very good. For number one, it's good for users. First of all, there's a low barrier to entry. David Campy will talk about why this is important. It's built on Electron, so it feels kind of like Chrome. All of the keyboard shortcuts that you're used to are there. You know how to expect tabs. It renders very nicely. It's fast. It's usually fast. It certainly is hackable. So the original goal of Atom was that people could extend it, and that's certainly true. There's plenty of plugins that are available. And through these plugins, it's got many of your typical IDE features that you might expect from offerings which you would perhaps pay a lot more money for than the zero money that you pay for VS Code. A killer feature that has been used, well, that certainly I thought was most useful, is the remote development capability, where you can connect to a remote machine, a server or cloud or something like that, and develop as though it's happening on your laptop. The other nice thing is that there's a familiar environment everywhere. VS Code is cross-platform. You can use it on Windows, of course, because it's a Microsoft product, and Linux and Mac, and believe it or not, FreeBSD. It's in ports, though I don't know a single FreeBSD user that wants to use VS Code, but it's there if you should want it. And then interestingly, VS Code Server, which is sort of GitHub Codespaces and has been used by other companies such as Gitpod, allows you to do your development in a browser. So if you have something with a browser, a phone, a tablet, a laptop, you can just connect to this, what is effectively a web server, and use exactly the same interface to do your development completely remotely, which I think is a very, very interesting technology. It's good for developers too, for one very good reason, is that it's got one code base to do all of these things. There's not fragmented code bases, and there's lots of different functionality. So it's there's lots to like about VS Code, and yeah, I should have made the font a little bit bigger. One of the reasons that it's adopted so well is that it kind of does everything. So I took this screenshot after I had just installed VS Code last week. I opened up a folder with a little bit of sample Python code in it, and it saw, oh, hey, you're using Python. Would you like to install some plugins to make VS Code more useful? And the options are certainly or tell me more. So if you click on the tell me more option, you get a little bit of a blurb describing things, and your eyes glaze over when you try and read the license and all these kinds of things. So okay, well, that's fine. Install it, make my life better. And all of a sudden we have better syntax highlighting, which Kim has just told us is very important. And you can't quite see it, but in this bottom corner over here, something that I noticed that it did very well is that it noticed, you're using PyEnv. Let me load up your right virtual environment for you. It's right there. Bang. The experience is very good. Okay, so I'm going to switch to a demo, and I'm going to start up VS Code. It's really fast, as you can see. Actually, no, I can't really blame VS Code on that because I forgot to connect to my VPN. So I'm connecting to my desktop back at the office. Retry. There we go. And it's very good. It remembers where I was when I left off, and it's setting up. I don't know why it did that, because it was working an hour ago. It's working, but every now and again it needs to update software or something on the other side. And anyway, so remote development, as you can see, it works. It remembers where I was when I was busy working last time. It opened the same tabs. That my tabs are focused at the same place. What is this fancy thing that everyone likes? It's IntelliSense or something like that. So it offers you the ability to autocomplete. What do sensors have? Sensors.add. Okay, come on. Okay, now VS Code, help me out. I was trying to tell everyone how wonderful it was. Self.send. Okay, well, whatever. Okay, there we go. There's something vaguely useful. Look a little. The doc string pops up, the function prototype telling me about the arguments, all these kinds of things. So that's great. That's very useful. There's also other useful things. So for example, if I want to see where this function is used, it kind of parses all of the things. It shows me where it's defined. I can refactor it if I want to rename it to something different. then it will go through my entire code base and make sure that everything is consistent for me, which is very nice. It's got debugger functionality. I don't really use a debugger that much, but I know some people do like it, and if you use that, it's built right in. Something that I really like about VS Code is the Git integration. So on this little sort of tool over here, you can see what the status of your repository is, and just due to the font size, I suppose, I don't want to make it too much smaller, but it makes it very clear what has changed, and you can stage them for commit if you like. Pro tip, the little commit message box is probably one of the worst features of VS Code. It's just ridiculous. So my suggestion is, once you've staged everything and you're happy, just go to your terminal and then, okay, the pre-commit will fail because the code that I've added is nonsense there. So don't try this at home. We'll just skip pre-commit, and then it will give you a much more sensible way to write your commit message in a normal CLI editor. That commit message box is just stupid. Anyway, oh yes, and particularly of interest for Pythonistas, it has support for Jupyter notebooks, and in all their glory. It takes a little while to open up because it's got to start things behind the scenes, but the notebook is right here, and it's got my code, and it's got my output, and I don't need to faff with opening a Jupyter Lab session. So this is brilliant. One of the things that I really like about VS Code is the ability to, or it's got, I don't even really know how to call this. I've taken a test here, a unit test, and I've deliberately added a failure just to demonstrate the point. And in PyTest, I'm going to xk. So it will find this test and it will fail. No module named vkgdr. Okay, that's even better. So in your stack trace, when you've got a problem, it takes you to a line. It shows you line number, and I can just open that straight away in my editor, which I think is very useful. I like it. It's these little quality of life things that really count. So thank you for listening, and that's my talk today. So VS Code is actually very good, except when it's not. It's only fast sometimes, and fast. So in my previous slides, I had a little asterisk there. I don't need this. Why is the sidebar there? There we go. Oh, okay, yes, because the presentation is open here. It's only fast sometimes. That depends on what your reference is. If you noticed how quickly Emacs started up for Kim earlier, it was much faster than VS Code. On the other hand, if you're comparing it with much more heavy things like Eclipse or Visual Studio, then it will feel quite snappy. Yeah, so it depends on what point of view you're coming from. So the other sort of issue, I did use VS Code for a while, a few months as my primary editor. And what I noticed is that it uses a lot of memory. So I've got a handful of files open here, and if you look in the system monitor, it's a good, like, my mental arithmetic is not great, but I would total this up as probably about 350, 400 megabytes just by itself, and that's just a couple of text files. By itself, that might not seem so bad, but considering that a lot of us have got, apart from our IDEs, we've got Slack, which is another Electron app. We've got Spotify running, which is not Electron, but it's very similar. We've got, a browser, and let's face it, all of us have got browsers, and there are a gajillion tabs open because we don't close things. So memory is not as expensive as it once was, but it doesn't really help. it uses quite a lot of disk space as well. So I'm now on a remote session on my desktop at the office, and see if I can remember the incantation. Okay, this will take a moment, but this will tell us how much stuff that VS Code is storing on my hard drive. 343 megabytes. And the reason for this is when it connects, when you run in remote server mode, it basically connects and downloads not an entire copy, but a copy of itself, and runs that as a server to which your local copy connects so that it can interact. Because I'm the only person using this desktop, 350 megabytes is probably fine. I've actually seen it bigger. In fact, I'm going to show you. I'm going to run the same incantation on my local machine. So I've seen it bigger. The problem comes in when you have a lot of developers using the same server. They have a lot of copies of VS Code on the hard drive. The SSD is filled up pretty quickly. This is also relevant if you're using it. Okay, so in this case, 217 megabytes on my local laptop. If you're using a VPS, which has like a 10 gig SSD, or a Raspberry Pi, which is a small kind of thing, then that space usage becomes an issue. So VS Code is very good, but it comes at a cost. If you have an expensive modern computer, that cost is probably worth it for you, but it might not be the case. So you need to be aware of that before you make a choice. There are some reasons that are neither good nor bad that I would like for the user to consider when they're making their choice, and I'll fully confess to being quite opinionated in this regard. It may or may not align with your values. So if I pull up my Firefox, if you look at, this is Microsoft's VS Code page. It's free, it's built on open source, but there's a big terms and conditions apply over there because the core of VS Code is open source, but most of the good stuff that I've just showed you that makes it really, really useful is not open source. As evidence of that, here's a couple of examples. Why aren't the remote development extensions or their components open source? It doesn't say why they're not open source. It just says that they're not. They have a GitHub repo for issues and feature requests and that sort of thing. But Microsoft, that's their secret source, and they don't really feel like sharing it. Similarly, for interest of the Python community, Pylons is not open source. So to Microsoft's credit, they kind of pioneered the language server protocol. So if your editor supports this, you can have the same language server, say Jedi, for example, and you can plug it into anything, Emacs, Vim, VS Code, Sublime. It works everywhere. So you don't need to write a separate language server for each editor that you want to target. But Pylons itself is their implementation of this language server, and they're not interested in making it open source because that's Microsoft's business model. They want people to get stuff from them. So yeah, remote development, Pylons. Access to the Microsoft-hosted VS Code marketplace. Okay, so if I bring up my copy of VS Code again, and I decide I want to have some add-ons, all of these add-ons come from Microsoft. So GitHub Copilot, Jupyter, Flake8, a bunch of these things. You can only access this marketplace from first-party builds. If you were to do the open source thing, and not all of us do, but it's nice to do this sometimes, download the source code, try and compile it yourself, you have a substantially inferior experience to what happens if you get the stuff from Microsoft directly. The reason that this happens is Microsoft packages, so the code OSS is to VS Code as Chromium is to Chrome. It's the sort of basic open source one, which is MIT licensed, and they add some of their secret source and compile it afterwards. And the binary that you download here is actually a different license. How am I doing for time? Plenty. Oh, I thought I was running out. So you're a second-class citizen if you don't use the Microsoft branded one. So that's something to consider. The other one, telemetry is a divisive thing. I understand that it can be very, very useful. It can give the developers of an application lots of feedback as to what components of the what features get used, if there's bugs, if there's problems. In fact, I tried to show Stefan earlier today how opening a certain file crashed VSCode, and today it didn't crash. So maybe Microsoft noticed that I crashed it last week and fixed it, which is a good thing. I mean, I'm not complaining about that at all. I just find that telemetry on by default and closed source, so that I can't actually see what's actually being sent, I find it a little bit weird. If you're comfortable with that, that's fine, but you know, it's awareness that you need to be something that you need to be concerned about. And then my final kind of ideological take on this issue is that software monocultures are not particularly healthy. Having the freedom of choice to choose a tool that is good for you, I think that's very healthy. If there's a dominant protocol, like the language server protocol, I have no problem with that, because anyone can come along and implement something that speaks that protocol in a similar way to SMTP or HTTP, which are common protocols which we all use to interact with each other. That's good, but a default implementation is not good. It's the same reason that we avoid Google Chrome, because it's, you know, we want to avoid software monocultures. You guys do avoid Google Chrome, right? Do I need another talk about that? Yeah, there we go. I've got a few ideas. Okay, so moving on to recommendations. So my title was a bit clickbaity, and then I immediately proceeded to tell you why VS Code is actually a very, very good tool. So I'm making my job a little bit harder as to motivate why you shouldn't use it. Honestly, I don't really think that. If you want to use it, that's fine. But what I want you to do is be an informed user, that you know about the compromises. So start with your values. What is actually important to you? If you just want the best tool to get your job done, and you don't care about other things like that, then that's up to you. My values, and something that I would recommend that you think about, is strongly consider the importance of software freedom. There is a place for closed source commercial software. I know that we've got to make our bread and butter. Somehow, someone's got to pay the bills, and that's understood. But the tools that we use to create our software, I think, should allow us as much freedom as what we can reasonably get. The other factor to consider is a little bit of inconvenience is actually not as much of a problem as what you might think it is. The fancy code completion, it's nice, but ultimately it's not going to be the difference between making or breaking your project. Little quality of life things can be nice, but it's not worth trading something that is more important, a deeper value, in my opinion. So, practical recommendations. I'm going to, sorry to disappoint you here, I'm not going to make vague controversial statements. I'm going to go through a bunch of different things. If you don't mind commercial offerings, PyCharm from JetBrains is actually very good. I say that with the caveat of it's been 5 or 6 years since I last used it. It was very heavy the last time I used it, and my laptop was entry level at the time. So the functionality was very nice, but it was quite slow. VSCodium and Code OSS are also very viable options if you decide you can live without the first-party Microsoft features, but you like the concept of an Electron-based code editor. They're very stable, they're very mature, they work just as well as the normal VS Code, just minus the features that I mentioned. There are some interesting tools that are on the market is probably the wrong way to put it at the moment. Lapsy, I don't actually know how to pronounce any of these things, is a VS Code inspired editor written in Rust. And if something is written in Rust, you need to tell people about it. But with the result that it's very, very fast and it's quite memory efficient. It has the remote development functionality. This warning pre-alpha stage, it is very early in its development. I tried it out for a few minutes and managed to crash it only twice. But for the time that it worked, I was impressed. It worked very well. It's got remote development, it's got LSP, LightXL, and eCode are both very similar, also VSCode inspired, but they're written in C. Well, LightXL is partially C and mostly Lua. eCode is 100% Lua. I tried both of them out. They're both very good, very slick. LunaVim is another interesting one, which is a VS Code inspired wrapper around NeoVim. So I must confess it looks amazing, but I could not get it to work. I'm sure it's brilliant, but in the 25 minutes that I tried, I couldn't get it working. The caveat with all of these things is that they are some guy's personal project, so you will have to evaluate the viability of that for yourself. Something else, though, that was just one guy's personal project is Vim, which is the mainstay. And at this point, I don't know if a moment of silence is appropriate, but please spare a thought in memory of Bram Molenaar, the creator of Vim, who passed away a few weeks ago, who made an immense contribution to my life, and I suspect many of ours as well. There are more modern takes on more classical tools. NeoVim is a fork of Vim, and it's very mature and well developed and actively developed. Cocoon and Helix, I don't know how to pronounce this, I've only ever read it, are sort of slightly more modern takes on the concept of a modal editor, so they're Vim inspired, but they're a bit different. Micro is actually quite interesting. It was a different take on Nano, but has weird, like, I think Control W is to write out. I don't remember what Control S does. Micro has the thing like what you use. Control S is save. So if you're used to GUI stuff but needed a terminal editor from time to time, Micro is a very interesting one that I've tried out a little bit lately. And to address the elephant in the room, all of the cool things that I've told you about, Emacs has been doing them since before some of us were even born. So take that or leave it. So I've come to the end of my recommendations. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I approach the topic of my sort of daily workflow, which you can look at if you like. I'm going to start off with the remote development functionality, and I do that with just SSH. But James, you may say, VS Code leaves me where I left off last. Well, oh look, here I am, right where I left off. Oh, and look, there's some code, there's some auto completion. I was actually going to use this function. That's great. Oh, it's changed since. Yes, I really want to write it. But James, what about the tooltips with documentation about the functions? Well, give it a moment. Oh wait, there it is. There's a tooltip. There's a docstring. There's all the arguments and what their types are and all these kinds of things. And you can see that there's that MyPy is doing a little bit of checking in the background. There's, I suppose if I point at my screen, it's not going to help. There's a little warning telling me that there's something wrong on this line, and that's telling me what it is. Well, what else does VS Code do? It's got an integrated terminal. Okay, we can do that. There's a couple of ways that we could do that. We could open up a term from Vim, if you like, or you can use tmux and have the terminal over there. But yeah, so there's that option. But what about if you have the file explorer? Well, Vim has that as well, and I can see all the files in my folder. And now, okay, now I want to open. Okay, that was the one. That was the one that I had. I want to open a different file, and But what about the tabs at the top? Well, I have a few buffers open, and I can switch to them. Let's switch back to buffer 1. So go back, and I can split if I want to compare different parts. I can have things open side by side. I can have one of the buffers. I can open. Well, it's jumping straight to 6, but anyway. So I mean, Vim does the job, and I do try new tools from time to time, and so I would encourage you to try new tools. And VS Code, I mean, I'm a firm believer in don't knock it until you try it. So I've tried it, and I feel entitled to knock it. That's about all that I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've been trying for many years to find something that works better for me than Emacs, and sadly not yet succeeded. Sadly, they wouldn't let me take it on the plane. So, any questions? Any comments?
Everyone is just stunned.
Any challenges to duels? Question. I hope that's a question. I'm not for a duel.
No, just a question. You showed a lot. Okay, sorry. You showed a lot of things that are done through VS Code and also could also be done with Vim.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to find out is, can you do notebooks on Vim? Jupyter notebooks.
Notebooks. Well, yeah, I don't use notebooks. I suppose if you want to, you could. Yeah, I'm not really a notebook user, but if I wanted to, I could just start Jupyter Lab. Okay, I don't have it installed on this VM at the moment. But I'm not really a notebook user, so it's not something that's that I've ever really dealt with. Can Emacs do notebooks? It probably can. Kim tells me that it can, so like maybe Emacs is the tool for you. Kim, go ahead.
Going to make a slightly tongue-in-cheek comment, but the temptation to hijack the lightning talk session this afternoon to show everyone how to do in Emacs the things you've just done in Vim is strong, but I won't be doing that. I just want to note, obviously the one thing that maybe everybody knows, but it's worth noting, Vim and Emacs and those things are fantastic, but there is obviously a learning curve steeper than, say, in VS Code, and you're not discounting that, but that's something to bear in mind.
And if I have a couple of minutes, perhaps I can add just a little PS there. I consider this a feature rather than a bug. So, and I'll tell you why. Something like VS Code, it feels a bit too much like Chrome for me. So if I'm looking at this, my brain doesn't think working. My brain thinks I'm scrolling through Reddit and laughing at memes or something. I don't know. It's very difficult for me to actually like bring myself into the I'm now in a serious place and I need to work. On the other hand, if I see something like that, then my brain gets into the, okay, we're not fooling around now. Muscle memory is giving us those Vim shortcuts that we spend so much time learning. This is time to work. And for me, I feel that like the tyranny of convenience is not worth I feel more productive. I get into a flow state easier this way. And the fact that Vim is a little bit harder than VS Code, I feel helps that. It doesn't hinder it at all. So, yeah.
James, I'm a bit more open to using Vim, but does Vim support side-by-side code comparison?
Yes.
Does it? I've never
Vim
tried that. Yeah.
I don't remember how to invoke it now. You mean from the terminal? Okay, I'm gonna CP. Okay, I'm gonna make a change and just delete one line. Just Okay, there we go. It's not something that I use a lot. If I do that, I just normally use diff directly, and this I find works for me. But apparently it can. Thank you, Stefano.
Any other questions? Let me check Discord again in case there's a nuisance last time I checked.
Any heckles, any...
Latest in thread is Simon saying no pressure. Obviously not a VSCode
Well,
user.
I look forward to feedback from later on.
Cool. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone else.
Thank you very much.